Supercoach and Fantasy Sports Show. You are now listening to the Insight Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and you are listening to the Insight Fantasy Sport Podcast. I'm your host, the Supercoach Hawk, Rob Kennedy, sitting here with my good mate, the big horse, Mickie Dell. How are you, buddy?
Robbie, you going well, brother? How are you?
Good, man. Doing well. So we're continuing on our trend of doing things a little bit differently. We're doing what we call our standard squeeze super sixes. We've already done our defenders. We're moving on to our forwards in today's episode. Quick, short snapshot, under 15 minutes, even though we've got a lot to talk about on who's currently in the top six of averages, who's probably been pushing in there and pushing their case to move up into that top six, and who do we see if we see any smokies or sleepers to help everybody make those final primo decisions to fill their squads as we get down to the crunch time of the season. So, mate, to keep it short, to keep it sharp, let's dive right in. So currently sitting there in our top sixes as we go through: Josh Dunkley, Tim Taranto, Zach Butters, Connor Rozee, Errol Goulden, and Jack McRae, all sitting above 108 as an average. And then it drops down to your Caleb Daniel and your Jack Zeeble, who are at 102 and 99.4. Where does that sit with you, mate?
Yeah, your top six don't actually sound too bad, do they? When you're talking about that consistent 109-point average, if you're getting that from a forward for the rest of the year now, you're doing pretty well. So when you're talking about Jack Zeeble, we've spoken about him a couple of times in the past couple of weeks. He's on the outer, regardless of Kangaroos not having Aaron Hall in anymore. It looks as though teams are putting some work into him. If you've still got one from the Kangaroos, I still recommend Sheasel, but even there, he's not going to score over the top as to what he was earlier in the year. There's a pod that I'd like to talk about, and he's currently 10th overall for forwards. Have you got any idea who I might be speaking of?
Mate, I've got all the stats in front of me, but actually, no, I don't know. Who you got?
Luke Jackson.
Oh, he is sitting top 10 when it comes to last 5 games. Last 5 games, you're spot on.
Yeah,
he's averaging, massive. Yep.
So I just want to bring up that his 5-round average is almost 102. His next 3 games are against Carlton, who, as we know, have no ruck. Pitternet and De Koning both still out, and they're looking at running, I forget, is it Young that plays as a key back at times?
Yeah.
As a ruckman. The next game against Collingwood, teams do score well against Collingwood's ruckman, both Cox and Darcy Cameron. And then Sydney, they've only really got Tommy Hickey, who's been all out of sorts this year. So when you're looking at a 3-round snippet, and this is leading you into finals, they're pretty good games for ruckman to be playing against. So for me, he's one that I'm looking at bringing in purely from a pod standpoint.
The only fear factor for me, mate, is that he didn't go in the ruck in the last game. So against the Bulldogs, they held him out of playing that ruck. They actually put Josh Treacy in as the second ruck. I'm hearing that he's having a little bit, I want to say it was a hip issue or a bit of a shoulder issue. I did hear it this morning, and that's why they've held him out. If that's the case, that he's only sitting up forward, that's a worry for me. And if you do look at his last 3 games average, he's sitting on only 94. He had that massive game when Sean Darcy wasn't playing, and that's what I think's jacked it up. I would be holding off on him now, but I do like that he's pushed up there. And if people don't have like a Darcy Cameron and having that backup into their forward line, maybe he's one to look at, because maybe that's all freshened up and he does get that second ruck go out.
I'm thinking if you're looking between the two, the name you just threw up, Darcy Cameron and Luke Jackson, the difference there for me is that Darcy Cameron isn't Collingwood's number 1 ruck.
Yep.
So he is going to get the centre bounce attendances. He's going to get first crack at hit-outs to advantage the play around the ground. Mason Cox is going to play predominantly forward and only really giving him a chop out at times throughout the middle. So if you're tossing up between the two, my recommendation would be Darcy Cameron.
And I love that I got Darcy Cameron right now. He shat the bed a little bit last week, but with the news of Dunkley being out for 1, maybe 2, I got Sheldrick's on my bench. Darcy Cameron's still sitting there. I'm sitting in a pretty good spot without having to make a burn or trade. Two names for me to throw at you if we're going to start talking about last 5-round averages. Two sneak into that top 6. Nick Martin, your boy, is sitting at number 4 with a 5-round average of 118.2. And we've got Ben Keys, who's sitting there at number 6 with a 5-round average of 113.2. Out of the two, what do you think of them and which one would you be picking or non? Where are you at with both those players?
The Essendon players score well when we're winning. We've lost the last 2. Martin only scored 70-odd last week. We've got not a bad run coming up. It's not great. We've got Adelaide in Melbourne. We normally play well against them in Melbourne. Then we've got, I believe it's Geelong away. We've got GWS as well. So there's a few games there where he could potentially score well and does average pretty well against those sides. But Ben Keys, 5 games in a row over at 100, averaging, 119 in his past 3 weeks. Really, really killing it at the moment. When you're talking about key pod players that people were a bit scared to go near 3-4 weeks ago, I myself jumped on. Yes, I'm going to blow up my bubble. Yeah, the big horse. But let me tell you, I reckon this continues. You brought up a good stat earlier when we were discussing that he only spent 3% of his time last week in the centre bounces.
Yeah, mate. If we look at his last centre bouncer tendency, so I think we have to marry the two up together here. If we do it the right way and give everybody all the insight that we can. So if you look at him from round 11, he's gone 102, 106, 115, 119, and 124. If we marry that up, though, because everybody was saying, get on him, you were one of them, because he's now getting that midfield role. If we marry that up to his centre bounce attendances, if I just make sure I get Adelaide, I've been having a look at who we're about to talk about next. His centre bounce attendances from those rounds were 70%, 75%, 55, and 78. But last week, he went in for 3%. Does that mean he just put up a good score, which he can do sometimes as a pressure act forward? Are we nervous that those numbers drop away? For anyone who hasn't gotten on him yet, would you be touching him? Or would you go to who we go to next?
Yeah, I reckon he's solid. Yeah, well, if you look at Nick Martin, he's sitting at, 570K. He's averaging north of 120 in his past 5. But do you know how many times he's been at a centre bounce this year? In one game, he registered 13% game time at centre bounces. The rest is a big fat 0. I see a lot of similarities with the way that they structure around the ball around the ground, and that he's not at centre bounces per se, but when you got ball ups and clearances around the ground, they're around the stoppages. He could be tagging Merritt this week, who's going to take him to the contest. If Merritt pushes forward, he's not going to go back. They'll find someone else to go back onto him, and he'll move up the ground. So for Keys, I think he's solid. Who else you got in mind?
Well, DPPs are coming up. So one to look out for. I hope we might put the hammy curse. We put the hammy curse on Jaden Short with the DPP mentioning what they look like. So I apologise in advance if the hammies get a little bit tight this weekend, but Mr. Sam Walsh is still sitting on 36.8% forward line percentage. Now that's 1.8% above the 35% threshold that you need to get DPP status. We are talking about a primo mid. When you want to start looking at his numbers, he's well over the 100. He's been a little bit quieter lately, but now we're starting to talk about somebody that gets genuine centre bounce attendances. You know what he puts up. He's probably their best mid behind, obviously. Well, I think Chera's been their best player all year this year, but we're talking about a guy now in the last few rounds is at 81%, 83, 83, 80, and 71%. Then you're talking about, Sam Walsh. Sam Walsh was been a bit lower than that, but we still know that he's someone that's going to go right into that midfield and dominate.
We spoke about it earlier in the year, the back surgery. He came back. He was a bit slow. We did warn people, stay away from him until he starts ticking over some numbers and then look at him. Lo and behold, he's dropped 130,000 in price. The next 3 rounds, I did do some research, old mate, in regards to Sam Walsh. The next 3 games, Freo, he averages 122. Port, he averages 129. West Coast, he averages 110. These are over a 3-game range. So when you're looking at someone, I guess, a little bit poddish, There's not a high overall ownership of him, were you saying? 8%, was it?
He is at... Using a different screen at the moment, mate.
Yep.
He's in just 11, which is still pod. 11% of teams. Yep.
Absolutely. Yep. When you're talking about someone who could potentially have a really, really strong run home, he's got a good base now. He's had 4 solid weeks on the track. I think it's go time for Walsh. And for me, we've discussed it earlier, he's coming into my side this week.
Yeah, it's a good shout. I think you could definitely take the risk. Look, he's been strangely quiet. And again, his forward numbers have been a lot higher than where his midfield's at. But I think Carlton still need to start to pull the trigger. I think they were easing him back in after maybe there was a little something going on when you look at his centre bounce numbers and where they're at. So, look, I think he comes back into that midfield. He comes in and puts up some elite scores. So you could do a lot worse than bringing Sam Walsh into your side. So
Sam Walsh hasn't been this cheap since he was a rookie either.
Yeah, no, it's a good shout. So, look, they're the big changes. I don't think you can go wrong with any else. So, we've talked about the top 6 that are currently there. We've talked about the top 6 in the last 5 rounds. So, throwing in the Ben Keys, the Nick Martin. Look out for the DPP. I think the only major one coming through that we've just talked about is one Sam Walsh, number 1 pick back in the past. And the old smoky to have a little look at is Luke Jackson, of whether you need a little bit of cover for your rucks. Speaking of, next episode we're doing, mate, is the rucks. And I tell you what, if you want to talk about the change from the current 6 to the top 6 of the last 5 rounds, there's astronomical changes. So we encourage everybody to tune in and listen to what comes next. Any final words from you, mate, before we check out?
No, thank you to the Standard Squeeze. And for those that are purchasing via the website, throw your Insight 15 on the website. Get yourself 15% off a very good product.
So that's been our Standard Squeeze 6s for the forwards. We move on to the rucks. Until next time, this has been the Inside Fantasy Sport Podcast. Peace out.
See ya.